Hi, my name is Yvonne Whitty and I'm the Community Archaeologist with Wicklow County Council. And in this presentation for Heritage Week 2023, I'm going to discuss the Moneycarroll burials. So thank you very much for your time. 3 burials were discovered at Moneycarroll, Newtown Mount Kennedy, County Wicklow on Thursday the 25th of March 2021 while construction work was underway for a housing development in the suburbs of the village. The burials are found at the entrance to 2 housing estates, Mountain View and Sycamore Drive, and they were uncovered by contractors in advance of the construction of 22 social houses by Wicklow County Council. So these burials are of immense importance both locally and regionally, and they offer valuable insights into burial rituals and beliefs during the early medieval period. And this was a time of significant social change as Christianity was introduced into Ireland. This was mainly as a result of contact from Roman Britain in the 5th century AD. And the findings from these burials contribute to our understanding of how these changes manifested in the local context of Moneycarroll and Newtown Mount Kennedy. And they provide a glimpse into the cultural practices and religious beliefs of the past community that inhabited the area, and what life was like in the wider landscape in Moneycarroll between the 5th and the 8th centuries. In medieval times, the site of Moneycarroll was located within a topographic region known as Ibrin Coolan. During the early medieval period, the dominant tribe or sept or tua within the region was the Itaig, and it's likely that the women found during the excavations were from this tribal group. In the 8th century, the sept of the Ibrin had conquered the district, giving their name to the lands. So the early medieval period is depicted in surviving sources as entirely rural and characterised by the basic territorial unit known as the tua. It's estimated that there were probably at least 150 kings in Ireland at any given time during this period, each ruling over their own tua. And during this sometimes violent period, roughly circular defensive enclosures known as ring forts were constructed to protect farmsteads. And place name elements showing the presence of these sites include the name Rath, Lees or Doon. And these settlement enclosures consisted of a circular area enclosed by a large earth and stone bank with a deep outer ditch. The bank may have been surrounded by a timber palisade or a fence. And the smaller size and single bank type, the univallet, were more likely to be home to the lower ranks of society, while the larger examples with more than one bank, bivallet and trivallet, housed the more powerful kings and lords. The main enclosures ranged in diameter from 15 up to 60 metres, and some larger examples have multiple concentric enclosures. So these ring forts were built by farmers who would have practiced mixed agriculture with livestock and crops. So just over 500 metres northwest of the Moneycarroll burials, a large residential development uncovered a series of multi-period sites dating from the Neolithic to the early medieval period. So this site was excavated by IAC, and the largest feature consisted of a circular enclosure with a diameter of 50 metres. So based on the morphology and the finds assemblage, the excavator suggests that this enclosure represents the remains of a levelled ring fort of early medieval date. And this is the closest known ring fort site to the Moneycarroll burials. During the 7th and 8th centuries, there was a shift in burial practice as the church expanded its influence, and interment in enclosures associated with churches became to dominate the burial tradition. Before this, the ring fort inhabitants buried their dead in familial, secular burial grounds. But as the rules changed, the community transferred to the church lands, which was consecrated ground. So examples of church lands in the vicinity of Moneycarroll are Killadreenan and Kilmurray. So these early church sites were defined by one or more curvilinear enclosing elements, which could comprise of ditches, banks, stone walls and palisades. Recent research suggests that there are approximately 6,000 ecclesiastical sites in Ireland, which is on average one for every 10 townlands. And people also lived in and around these monastic sites. They were either monks living within the enclosure or workers on the monastic estate living in the area around the enclosure. And these sites are associated with a range of features, including the church, the graveyard, dwellings, various ovens, kilns, wells and mills, as well as field systems, although some of these would have been located outside the ecclesiastical enclosure. And the main farm animals on early church sites were cattle, sheep, pigs and goats. Barley was the dominant cereal, followed by oats and occasionally wheat and rye. And mills were often erected near these church sites with corn drying kilns, typically within the outer precincts. The yellow arrow is the location of where the Moneycarroll burials are found. And it's interesting to note that if you look at Kilmurry and Killadreenan, Kilmurry being on the left hand side of the screen, Killadreenan on the right, it's interesting to note that the distance between the two church sites is equidistant. There's not much between it. However, if you look at the relationship of the ring fort, 9.5, 1.5 metres, this is the closest church site to Kilmurry. So it's interesting that perhaps if the Ringfort inhabitants, if these women were associated with the Ringfort inhabitants, perhaps Kilmurry was the church that they later transferred to after the 8th century. So now back to the Moneycarroll burials. So the burials comprised the remains of 3 isolated lintel graves, all in a row, and each grave contained an articulated skeleton. Osteological analysis has identified the skeletal remains as belonging to 2 females and 1 probable female, and all were aged between 35 to 50 years of age. So the top picture on the top right is called a pre-excavation plan. So this is a drawing when the skeletons have been cleaned back before we remove the lintels, and then below is a mid-excavation plan after the lintel stones have been removed. This is just a photograph of the excavation of the burials. So you can see the grave on the left hand side of the photograph. This has got its lintel stone still intact. And then the grave on the centre and on the right have had their lintel stone removed. And now the burials are being cleaned up, ready to be photographed and drawn. So now we're going to discuss the burials. So burial 1, the most southerly of the 3, was aligned west-northwest to east-southeast. And the sides of the cut were lined with these upright, trimmed blue-grey slate stones. And then there was round packing stones between the cut and the lintels were visible at the foot of the grave. The foot of the grave was very clearly defined, as you can see in the photograph, by a slate stone, and it makes the shape almost like a coffin. The skeletal remains were poorly preserved. The body had been placed within the grave in a supine position, so that's on its back. An osteological analysis has identified the burial as that of an adult female aged 40 to 50 years old. And the top of the grave was sealed with 5 large lintel slabs, which at the time of excavation had collapsed in on the grave on top of the burial. So the lintel construction of the grave indicates that there would have been a cavity within the grave in antiquity, and that the grave fill, which was around the skeleton, was a result of natural infilling of the grave once the lintel stones had collapsed. So the preservation of the bone appears to have been affected by the soil. So once the burials were excavated, they were analysed by Mairead, our osteologist. So skeleton 1 was 55% complete, 40 to 50 years of age and a female. So the sex of the burial is based on an examination of the pelvises, long bones and the skull. So the skull of skeletons 1 and 2 were distinctly female in morphology. Then looking at the dental pathology of skeleton 1, it had slight caries, dental enamel hypoplasia, periodontal disease and calculus. So dental caries form when bacteria in the plaque metabolize sugars in the diet, which produce an acid that can cause loss of minerals from the teeth, which eventually create a cavity. So caries affected 27%, so that's 8 out of 29 of the teeth of skeleton 1. And they range in severity from pinpoint to small. So DEH is the presence of lines, pits or grooves on the surface of the crown of the tooth. And they occur when its formation is stalled during periods of malnutrition, disease, during early childhood. So DEH was recorded in 17%, so that's 5 out of 29 of the teeth of skeleton 1. So this would indicate a period of stress during her early childhood. And then periodontal disease can occur as a result of inflammation of the gums. So this was visible as gingivitis on the mandible of skeleton 1. Calculus, which is mineralized plaque, is commonly found in archaeological populations. This is found where the dental hygiene may have not been that rigorous, and if the plaque is not removed effectively, these deposits can mineralise, form concretions of calculus on the crowns and roots of the teeth and along the gum line. This mineralisation can also occur if the diet is high in protein. Looking at other pathologies, so there was degenerative joint disease of the spine, which is usually the most common type of joint disease observed during this period. And then there was also a lamellar bone formation. So Murray recorded that on skeleton 1, the internal meningeal arteries were pale in colour in comparison to the surrounding bone. And she suggested that this would indicate that whatever inflammation or infection was affected by the person, that it had healed at the time of death. And these arteries supply blood to the protective layers of the brain and the spinal cord. So the central burial was burial 2, and this was found within a lintel grave also. It was west-northwest, east-southeast aligned. Burial 1 was located to its left and burial 3 to its right. And the grave cut was subrectilinear in plan. The sides were lined with these packing stones, and these sat behind these upright grey slate slabs. And the burial then was placed within the grave in a supine position, so on their back. Osteological analysis of the skeleton has identified the remains as an adult, possibly female, aged between 35 to 45 years of age. The hands were placed over the pelvis and the foot bones were closely placed together, indicating that this burial was probably wrapped in a shroud prior to placement in the grave. So burial 2 was 65 to 70% complete, a female aged between 35 to 45 years, and she had caries, periodontal disease, abscesses and calculus. Other pathology visible on the bone was degenerative joint disease of the spine and Schmorl's nodes. So now we're going to look at the dental health of burial 2. She had caries, periodontal disease, abscesses and calculus. So you can see calculus in the red box there on the left hand photograph of skeleton 2, and then on the right hand photograph the arrow highlights caries, and then the box with the little hole is actually an abscess. So caries affected 11% of the teeth of skeleton 2, so that's a little black dot, and they were small. She had calculus, and it affected 87% of the teeth of skeleton 2, and dental abscesses. Now, dental abscesses form when bacteria enter the pulp cavity of a tooth, causing inflammation and a buildup of pus at the apex of the root. Eventually, a hole forms in the surrounding bone, which you can see clearly visible in the red box there, in this photograph on the right, and this allows the pus to drain out and relieve the pressure. So they can form as a result of dental caries, heavy wear of the teeth, damage to the teeth, or periodontal disease. Other pathology noted on burial 2 was that she had degenerative joint disease of the spine and Schmorl's nodes. So degenerative joint disease is the most common type of disease observed, and it's characterised by bone formation, osteophytes, and porosity around the joint surfaces, as you can see on the photograph on the left. And this can cause discomfort and disability if severe. So skeleton 2, burial 2's vertebrae, although fragmented, did have evidence of degenerative changes. And this degeneration was also more prevalent on the right hand side than the left hand side of the body, Murray noted. Schmorl's nodes, the middle photograph, is another condition that can affect the spine, and they manifest as indentations in the upper and lower surfaces of the vertebrae bodies, caused by the pressure of herniated discs. So discs may rupture due to trauma, but vertebrae weakened by infection, osteoporosis, or a neoplastic disease may be more vulnerable. So 3 Schmorl's nodes were recorded on the vertebrae of skeleton 2, and these depressions were only 2 to 3 millimeters in size, and the photographs on the right hand side shows what they look like. So you can see these little indentations or depressions visible on radiographs and a CT scan. Burial 3 was the most northerly of the 3 burials. It was east-west aligned, and as was the case of burial 1 and 2, the grave cut was subrectilinear in plan. A layer of sub-rounded packing stones lined the cut, and then in front of these were placed these bluish grey slate stones that were trimmed. and they lined the sides of the grave. So the foot and the head of the grave are clearly defined by the slate slab lining stones, as you can see in the photograph on the left and the middle. An osteological analysis of the skeletal material indicates that this was an adult female between 35 to 45 years of age. The hands were placed over the pelvis and the feet were tightly placed together, and the leg was crossed, as you can see in the photograph on the right. So this indicates that this burial too was wrapped in a shroud prior to burial. The right leg of the skeleton, as you can see, was crossed over the left, and it had been laid diagonally within the cut of the grave, and it seemed that the grave was a little bit too short maybe for the burial to accommodate the body. So the grave was then sealed with a series of slate slabs or lintels. And the burial tree had very little fill surrounding the body, and it was the best preserved of all of the tree skeletons. So burial 3, she was 70% complete, 35 to 45 years old, and a female. She had caries, periodontal disease, dental wear, abscesses, and calculus. She also had degenerative joint disease of the spine. Now, my pronunciation might not be correct on some of these. Osteochondritis dissecans of the right distal femur, and scoliosis of the mid-spine. So now we're going to look at what the pathology actually looks like on the bones. So degenerative joint disease was particularly evident on skeleton 3, and it was most visible on the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae. She also had a type of arthritis that causes inflammation in the joints and ligaments. As you can see on the photograph on the right, this shows you a healthy spine versus a spine that has this type of inflammation. And then the central photograph shows a localized debt or necrosis of a small part of the surface of a joint. And this can be caused by trauma. And when this happens, the damaged piece of bone can become detached from the rest of the surface of the joint, and it's known as osteochondritis dissecans. And you can see it quite clearly here in the photograph there. These lesions appear as roughly circular areas with a porous surface. And there was also evidence of healed infections on the surfaces of the long bones and the endocranial surfaces of skeleton 3. So we've looked now at the burials and looked at the diseases on the joints, but now we're going to look at the actual the alignment of the burials in the grave and how they were positioned, as this can tell an awful lot. So when we're excavating, we have to be very careful to note, are the feet tightly wrapped together? Where's the hands? Where is the body placed? Are they by their side? In the case of the burials of Moneycarroll, the arms were all placed over the pelvis. The legs were tightly bound together, as you can see. In the case of burial 3, the legs were even crossed, and on the right hand side it shows you the ankle bone and the foot bone, and you can see that these are very tightly placed together. So what this tells us is that these burials were all wrapped in a shroud prior to burial. And that we can see from research by Betty O'Brien, which relates to burial tradition in this transitional period. So at this time there were still pagans and Christianity was being adopted, but we cannot automatically show that, I suppose, a supine skeleton aligned east-west without grave guts, we cannot automatically see them as a Christian. However, the use of a winding sheet, which is what we have at Moneycarroll, or a shroud, is a strong indicator of the adoption of Christianity. And with this in mind, the burials of Moneycarroll are likely to be Christian. No grave goods are recovered from the burials. However, we know that their placement indicates that they were wrapped in a winding sheet prior to burial. And in the early medieval period, these winding sheets or shroud were secured by stitching or tying. So, whereas in the later centuries, pins were used to hold the material in place. So we had no pins at Moneycarroll. So we could just assume that they were stitched or tied together. Well, you might ask, well, why would they wrap the burials in a shroud? Well, what they were doing is these people were following Christian burial traditions that follow gospel descriptions of Christ, having been wrapped in a winding sheet of fine linen, as depicted here at the base of the cross of scriptures in Clonmacnoise. He was then buried. And so what we have at Moneycarroll are the women, and they're being buried in a fashion similar to what we see on the photograph at the left-hand side, and they're being given a Christian burial. So when we were excavating the burials at Moneycarroll, our question was, Which is the earliest? What happened? Were all three buried together? Why is burial 3 a bit offline to the others? So the only way to really tell the story or to find out was to get radiocarbon dating done of all of the 3 burials, and we were lucky that Wicklow County Council funded this. So what we see is that in 434 AD, a group of people came together, they dug up a grave, and they worked carefully together to get the stones, to gather them, to trim them, to line the grave, to wrap the body in a shroud, and burial 2 was laid to rest. So then, almost a century later, they came together again. They dug another grave and they buried another lady. Burial 3 was laid to rest. And then finally, a short while later, in around 585, burial 1 was laid to rest. After this, burial stopped at this site. The 3 individuals buried at Moneycarroll were high status. Their graves were quite laborious to construct, and the time and effort spent indicates that they were held in high rank in their community. Radiocarbon dates obtained from the 3 individuals show that burial 2, the middle one, was the oldest, producing a mid-5th century date. A century later, burial 1 and 3 were placed in graves either side. The placement of burial 1 and 3 was not random, and the alignment of the 3 graves in a neat row shows that care was taken to achieve this result. It also strongly suggests the location of burial 2 was known and remembered by the local community, and perhaps its memory was passed down among the generations. And it's also possible that this burial was marked above ground. All the indications are that burial 2, the central burial, may have been important to a nearby community, perhaps the Ringford community. They may even have been a foundation burial. Consequently, the other 2 burials were probably women who were important to a later community. They might have been deliberately inserted either side of burial 2 in order to create the impression of a continuity by a new incoming group. The choice of the burial location may also have had a political significance, as several of these other burial places are located close to territorial boundaries. The associated women were possibly regarded as guardians of dynastic territory. Some of these burials in other examples also became foundation burials, around whose graves communal cemeteries evolved. At a local level and regional, these are of great significance. They provide a glimpse of burial ritual and belief during a period of great social change. The women laid to rest here were high-status individuals, and the type of graves and position of the skeletal remains and the preparation of the bodies, wrapped with shrouds and winding sheets, suggests that they follow the Christian faith and mark the presence of Christians in the area as early as the mid-5th century. In conclusion, the archaeological evidence proves that the site, once significant, underwent a process of abandonment and vanished from consciousness until it was rediscovered in the course of investigations for new housing development in 2021. The success of this excavation owes much to the people who are listed here. However, several unanswered questions still remain. Among these questions, one pertains to the whereabouts of the remaining members of the kin group to which these women belonged. Also, were these women related? These may be answered in the future through ancient DNA analysis. But for now, thank you for listening to the intriguing narrative of the Moneycarroll burials.